Greetings again, chess fans. Today I will look at my round 5 game from the recently held Genesis online tournament. And without further ado, let's begin looking at the game. My opponent in this game was a youngster by the name of Taydan Balliram. I opened with e4 and my opponent played c5, which is the Sicilian defense. I played knight f3. He played knight c6 and I opened the game with d4. He took the pawn on d4 with his pawn and he followed up. When I took back with my knight, he followed up with an immediate g6. So we're looking at some sort of accelerated dragon perhaps. And I played bishop to e3. He fianchetted his bishop. And now I decide to play a somewhat unusual move, c3. Of course, this blunts the attack of the fianchetted bishop, but it does not develop any new pieces, so it's not a very commonly played move. He proceeds to develop with knight f6, attacking my pawn at e4, so I defend that pawn with my bishop on d3. He castles kingside, and I do the same. And after I castle on the king side, he decides to play d5, opening up the game. I exchange pawns. And now an interesting move, I take off his knight to create an isolated pawn on c6. I continue development, queen to e2, and he plays bishop to e6. After knight to d2, he takes the half open file with his rook on b8. I block the effect of that rook with knight to b3. And he develops his queen to c7. And now I begin to target the bishop, which seems a bit awkwardly placed on e6. So he repositions it to d7. I did not like the idea of my bishop on e3 being exchanged for a knight. So I proceed to play it to g5, hitting the e7 pawn. He defends this pawn with rook to e8. And I didn't see anything better than retreating my knight back to the b3 square. He once again played bishop to e6. And now I play f4. When I play f4, he checks my king with his queen, forcing it into the corner. And he'd like his knight to come to perhaps reach f2 via g4, so he repositions it to f6. I play my knight to d4, attacking his bishop once again on e6, and once again he retreats it to d7. That gives me time to play b3 because his queen and rook were bearing down on b2. He targets my c3 pawn, which I easily defend with rook a to c1. However, there's a pawn sacrifice involved in this move because he can now take off the knight, which he did, and when I capture the pawn, he takes off the pawn. My feeling was that the activity of my pieces would compensate for that pawn, and the computer seems to agree with me, because after queen to b6, the position here is evaluated by engines such as Ruffian. It's evaluated as being totally equal. I now play f5, trying to attack his king side. He plays his rook to c8, perhaps thinking that his pawn on c6 needs to be defended before he goes about grabbing anything with his bishop. And I now open up his king side with f take g6. He replies f take g6 as well. And this is an interesting juncture in the game. After some thought, not much thought because it was a 10-minute game, each player had 10 minutes to complete all their moves. So after not much thought, I played quite a decent move, h4. However, the computer shows a very interesting alternative at this point. So I'll show you the alternative that the computer came up with. And that is to play rook to h4. And there are some interesting lines in this variation. For instance, we could see rook to f8, after which white has a stunning move right here. Rook take h7. If he was to capture the rook with his king, for instance, it would lead to an immediate loss of the game. Queen to h5 check. He cannot take the queen because of the pin. The g6 pawn being pinned by the d3 bishop. So his king would have to go perhaps to g7, after which queen take g6 leads to a checkmate in the corner of the board. So quite an aggressive line, attacking with the pieces with rook to h4. And another line from that variation. After rook take h7, if he tried something like, perhaps tried rook take f1 with a check, we find that after queen take f1, rook to f8, the move rook to h8 would be winning. Not just winning a rook or a piece or anything like that, winning the game immediately. After king to h7, you'd have queen to h6, and there's no escape for the king. So that would be a lovely way to play as well. However, I didn't see that in the game and I played h4 instead. My idea was also to create some breathing room for my king on the back rank, so I pushed the h pawn, thinking about how Alpha Zero used to play and maybe if I can get this pawn straight up the board. He replied knight to f6, and I began to pressurize the f6 point now. He tries to defend it with his king. I keep piling on the pressure. I have 4 pieces, my queen, 2 rooks and a bishop, all pointing on the f6 point. He tries to defend with queen to d8. There's actually a winning sequence here which comes about after rook take knight. And after the pawn recaptures, because you are now able to capture with your bishop, he would have to sacrifice his queen. And it's not just a loss of the queen, but in fact there's a checkmate sequence forced. After moves such as this. And the pawn does go forward in Alpha Zero style. There's a forced mating sequence which I'll leave you to figure out off air. Even in the game that as it was played, what transpired in the game after h4 was after h4 he replied knight to f6. I piled on the pressure, and at this point I played h6, forcing his king back, and he moves into the corner. In the game itself, I noticed my opponent was low on time, and I didn't want to force the issue here. So I simply stepped back with my queen to there, and he played bishop to f5. And now I took the knight with my bishop, and my opponent actually ran out of time at this point, but I have follow-up moves such as g4, which would give me at least a piece advantage. So I had a winning position with h4 as played, but that sequence that the computer showed with rook to h4 is even stronger. So that was basically how I won my fifth game of the tournament. And that would be the last game that I'm showing from this tournament. Thank you very much for watching once again.